So just the usual disclaimer, nothing I say will have anything to do with the IMF, because it's going to be far too radical for that. So we're coming up to the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. That happened in 1833, and William Wilberforce, that had been his life's work. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807, and then slavery itself was abolished by the UK Parliament in 1833. I'm afraid we generally think that that's now a done deal. Yes, we have slavery still going on in the shady parts of our underground economy, and how terrible that is in terms of human trafficking and forced labor. But in the main, we don't think it's part of our society, our economy. And so Wilberforce has never appeared on our banknotes. His name doesn't seem to have been thought of, because that's now a done deal. We've moved on from that. What I'm going to suggest that from the biblical perspective, we've got a problem brewing, because debt, in the Bible's terms, is actually slavery. It's servitude. It's financial servitude initially, and then if it continues, it can become real slavery. Our problem is that even though we've had the worst financial crisis for 2 centuries, we have not fundamentally understood the role of debt has played in producing that, and we have not taken this opportunity to resolve our thinking and change the way we do things. So the big message is that because we've missed that opportunity, we are embarking on a period of debt slavery in our society and others, particularly the slavery in debt of the young to pay the old. The other big message is that this, for the church, is an open goal. There is a great opportunity for the gospel, because the gospel is framed in the language of debt and slavery. Christ came to bring us freedom from slavery, and therefore that analogy is woven throughout the Old and New Testaments. And so we have a wealth of material to think about and apply. My main point will be that we face a Wilberforce moment, that if we don't do something about it, if we don't think about fundamentally changing the way we do finance, there will be a point when either we'll reform the way Wilberforce did, or we're going to have to do something much more radical to free the debt slaves. So first of all, am I talking complete nonsense? From a standard economics or law perspective, of course I am, because borrowing is nothing to do with slavery. It is an exercise of freedom. It is called credit. It sounds good. So if you talk to the chief economist at the Bank of England, he'll tell you that if you borrow, all you're doing is deciding to bring forward consumption to now from the future. You have decided to buy a house or a car and want it now. What's the problem? You've decided to commit income from the future to bring it forward now. Now the problem is that just takes the view of debt and credit as a contractual measure, as an economic construct. It doesn't understand the relational aspects that is going on. So why the Bible takes a different view is that when you borrow, you are making a promise. You are committing yourself in the future. And so in English we have this close link. We are giving our bond, we are giving a promise. But the problem is that means that we are then in bondage. We are not free in the future because we have made that promise. And so that idea that credit is an exercise of freedom is exactly the opposite of what is going on in reality. We have made a commitment. And so Scripture very clearly says this. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave or servant of the lender. It's just very clear. You're starting to work for somebody else when you borrow, particularly at interest. This is why then if you default, if you don't meet your commitments in a debt contract, this is actually worse than theft. Because not only are you not giving back what you borrowed, but you're also breaking your promise. And so previous cultures took default from debt much more seriously than we do. Because it's not just selfish use of property, but also breaking a promise too. And so there could be the selling of the person into slavery because they couldn't meet their debts. And so this comes up in the Old Testament. If you don't meet your obligations, you need to do so, and therefore you have to labor to pay those debts off, or you could be sold into servitude to do so. Psalm 37 says it's the wicked who borrow and don't repay. And hence you get this close link between the idea of sin and debt. You get this in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our sins can be translated as forgive us our debts. In German, it's a very close word, parallel, Sünden schulden, the debt sinner, which is why Mrs. Merkel isn't too keen on relieving the Greek debt, because you'd then be compliant in Greek sin if you were to do so. So we have this idea of debt as sin, and as we know in the New Testament, that is a clear theme that comes up. When you come at it from this relational perspective, what's going on in our society? Well, despite the crisis, very little debt has been written off. Once or twice it's happened in the UK. So, for instance, 1 or 2 bondholders in Bradford and Bingley and Northern Rock lost money. And we're coming up, shock horror, to a possibility that some bondholders in the co-op may lose money. But other than that, in the main, debt holders have been made whole. Borrowers have been bailed out, usually by government, to enable that to happen. So very little debt has been written off. Foreclosures are occurring, mortgages are written down, but not very much, nothing like you've seen in America. And so what has happened is that through the bailouts, through interest rates staying very low, through government running enormous deficits to keep the show on the road, debt has been moved forward. Our debt levels are actually higher than they are now across the economy than they were in 2008. So very little has actually been resolved. We have public debt of over £1.25 trillion now. We have mortgage debt of almost £1.5 trillion, corporate debt of about £1.5 trillion. And so that total debt burden has just been pushed forward and has not been resolved because interest rates have been kept very low. The Bank of England has printed almost £400 billion to buy government bonds to keep the show on the road. Surprisingly, whatever the government tells you, the deficit has come down, but is now not falling. If you strip out the special measures used, the deficit actually went up slightly last year and is at levels much higher than would have been thought normal in peacetime for any UK government. So whatever you think about austerity, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of what's going to be needed. So we've got a problem because we are still borrowing heavily via the government, so collectively as taxpayers we're being indebted. We've got mortgage debt now growing again. We are now financing student education through debt rather than taxation. And the worry is that this is now seen as normal. This hasn't been challenged. We haven't radically changed the way we do finance. And so this government and previous governments have kept the show on the road. And we need to keep doing this to keep the economy ticking over. Recall that the Prime Minister almost 2 years ago was stopped saying in a speech that it would be a good idea to pay down some debt at the Conservative Party conference. That was released in an early draft of his speech, and an hour of lobbying by the British Retail Consortium made sure that he couldn't actually tell anyone to pay down debt, because that would be a terrible thing for the economy. We have a Chancellor now who celebrates the idea that it's a good thing to be able to have a mortgage where you only put 5% down. This is part of an aspirational society. So we have house prices that are way overvalued. We should have a mortgage system, if we're having houses financed like that, where people need to be responsible, have plenty in a deposit before they buy a house. But no, we must keep that sort of pyramid scheme going of over-indebtedness of new borrowers to keep prices up. So nothing has fundamentally changed. We've tried to make banks safer, but bank borrowing is now bigger than it was before the crisis. We've increased our debt levels. What should Christians do about this? If we think that debt is slavery, what's got to be done about it? Well, first of all, Christians can live out a much more debt-free life themselves. Amazingly, the New Testament talks a lot about living freely. God's ideal is an ownership society, not a slave society. And that is the ideal set forth in the Old Testament about universal ownership of property and freedom from debt, but also freedom from oppression by others. So if you go to Micah 4 or Isaiah 2, the great ideal is that everyone has their own vine and their own fig tree, and they are producing for themselves and have property and freedom. And then this gets translated by Paul in particular to the idea of freedom for the Christian. He tells the Corinthians, some of you were slaves before you became Christians. Now don't enslave yourself again. Live as free men. He says, do not be yoked to unbelievers. Amazingly, we apply that to don't get married to a non-Christian, but then don't apply it to why are we enslaving ourselves in debt to people outside the church. So first of all, there is a radical injunction to challenge this idea personally about why are we indebting ourselves to others. Then there's the idea of, well, we need to help others free themselves from debt. There is good work going on by Christians Against Poverty at the moment, Credit Action and others, to educate and counsel those in debt trouble about how to get out of their difficulties. But this should be seen as a mission opportunity for every local congregation, not just in caring for their own members, but for their community as well. And so that we can think about interest-free loan funds within our congregations to help each other get out of debt. Why are we putting our money, those of us who have savings, in banks, who then lend them to our brothers and sisters to enslave them? Why aren't we cutting out the middlemen and doing it freely ourselves? But then that can apply to those outside the church as well. Interestingly, of course, I was encouraged by the Archbishop of Canterbury's desire to put Wonga out of business recently, but it's not really radical enough for me. I want much more of a challenge to think about how do we get people out of debt slavery more widely in society. Just a nice point on the side. Apparently Wonga, I understand, is not debt financed. It itself does not enslave itself to creditors. But then we need to talk more radically about public policy, about switching this whole mentality away from debt as the first and ideal way of financing everything. And so that can apply to how do we do house finance. We need to encourage much more lease-to-buy contracts where we share equity rather than indebt people in mortgages. That way we won't have this absurd conclusion where we have people in the media celebrating the idea that houses get expensive, house prices go up. I was reading a newspaper article on this week, this is a virtuous circle that house prices are rising. We'd never think that way about food or petrol or clothing, but we do it about housing, another staple of human existence. So we need to change our mentality completely about that. We can start thinking much more seriously about thinking of an alternative way of financing student education, be that a graduate tax, be that endowment of universities or whatever. I fear that we may well follow the American line whereby student debt has now grown to over $1 trillion. People are coming up to the age of 60 in the US and they are still paying their student debts. These are debts that are not relievable in insolvency proceedings in the US, and non-performing loans have risen to 25%. So there's defaults and delinquencies of over a quarter of the student debt stock in the US. What it has facilitated is an enormous rise in college fees. So as you subsidize people's indebtedness, what happens is not that they get a better deal, but the producers start paying themselves more to take advantage of that. And the big elephant in the room that we have yet to really address is public debt. The US, the UK, and Japan are structurally insolvent intergenerationally. We have got to close the amount of public borrowing by about 1/10 of the economy. It didn't get as bad here, but at one point in the crisis, the US government was borrowing over 40% of what it spent. If you look across generations, there are calculations that the US government, the sort of intergenerational debt is between 70 and $200 trillion. We're not quite there in terms of the size of our economy, but we have a similar problem. We are not counting on the government's balance sheet all the promises we are making now to future pensioners, civil servants, people who are going to use the health system. And so whereas to balance its books intergenerationally, the UK economy, the UK government should be running a surplus of several tens of billions, we're still borrowing 125 billion a year. And so we've got to measure that correctly and start thinking about the relationship between generations. The current generation needs to pay its way, so it is not enslaving the future generations. So to conclude, we have this bizarre outcome where over-indebtedness caused the greatest crisis our society has known since the Second World War, and yet we haven't learnt the lessons. We've papered over the cracks, we've bailed out, and we've continued to borrow. So we face a moment of decision. Either we need to address this obsession across our society, and we need a Wilberforce to do it, or we're going to face a moment of crisis where the debt slaves will rise up, as they did under Spartacus, and rebel. And that will either be in default or it'll be inflation, both forms of theft. Without reform, we're facing that moment of crisis where bad things are going to happen.